I still remember the suffocating silence in that courtroom. The air smelled of old wood and polished marble, the kind of scent that clung to courthouses and churches, places where truth was supposed to be sacred. But on that morning, truth felt like a knife pressed against my throat. I sat there, hands trembling against my black dress, the same one I had worn at my husband's funeral just weeks before. 30 years of marriage had ended with me clutching flowers beside his coffin, tears burning my cheeks, and now I was about to hear his final words, his will, his last judgment of who I was to him. My heart pounded so violently that I thought people around me could hear it. I tried to steady my breath, but every inhale carried the weight of dread. When the judge called for silence, I already knew this moment would either destroy me or redeem me. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, the sound of paper shuffling, echoing like thunder in the hall. My family sat scattered behind me. Some of them avoided my eyes, others whispered behind their hands, as if my grief was something to gossip about. At the corner, I saw Claire, the nurse, who had cared for my husband during his last year. She sat there with her perfect posture lips pressed in a small, satisfied smile. Something in my gut twisted. Her presence was not that of a grieving caretaker. It was the smugness of someone who already believed the battle was won. The lawyer cleared his throat and every muscle in my body tightened. The last will and testament of Mr. Richard Johnson, he announced, his voice cold and mechanical, as if he was reading the weather report instead of a dying man's final decree. I braced myself. He began with the usual introductions, the legal jargon that meant nothing to me. My ears buzzed, waiting for the words that would shape my life, and then they came. I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including the family, home savings, and investments to my caregiver, Ms. Claire Williams. The sound shattered through me like glass breaking. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked up, certain I had misheard, certain my grief was warping my senses. But no. The lawyer's lips had formed the words clearly, and Claire's smile had widened. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. My niece put a hand over her mouth. My sister-in-law leaned closer to her husband and whispered something I couldn't catch, but I could feel their eyes cutting into me sharp as blades. Betrayal burned hotter than the humiliation. 30 years of loyalty, of sleepless nights waiting for him to come home, of washing his shirts, of holding his hand through fevers, of burying my dreams, to raise his children, all erased by a single sentence. My husband, the man I believed in even as his illness consumed him, had handed everything to the woman who brought him soup and pills. I wanted to scream, to stand up and pound the table, to shout that it wasn't true, that Richard couldn't have done this to me. But my voice was frozen in my throat. I could only sit, my face pale, my chest heaving, my fingernails digging into my palms until the pain was unbearable. Behind me, whispers multiplied. So she was nothing after all. Imagine the nurse gets it all. Poor woman, 30 years for nothing. Every murmur stabbed deeper, branding me as the discarded wife, the obsolete widow, the one who was no longer needed. I forced myself to glance at my son, hoping to find comfort in his eyes. But he avoided my gaze. His shoulders slumped, his face unreadable, but the silence was worse than any words. He didn't defend me, didn't stand up, didn't say, "This can't be right." He just sat there, as if paralyzed, or worse, resigned. And Claire. She crossed her legs slowly, like a queen adjusting her throne, her fingers brushing against the pearls at her neck. Pearls I recognized. They had once been mine, a gift from Richard on our 20th anniversary. Now they were draped around her like a trophy. The lawyer's voice droned on, explaining minor details, but I could barely hear him over the roaring in my ears. My memories flooded back uninvited. Richard's coughs echoing in the night, me rushing to fetch water. His hand squeezing mine at the hospital, whispering that he was grateful for me. The evenings when I spoon-fed him soup, my own tears, falling into the bowl unseen. And now, his gratitude had translated into betrayal, a slap across my face, delivered from beyond the grave. My chest constricted so tightly I thought I might collapse in front of them all. What do you do when the person you trusted most rips away your dignity in front of a crowd? What do you do when 30 years of marriage are erased with the stroke of a pen? Tell me, if you were in my place, would you accept such humiliation quietly? Would you bow your head and walk away empty-handed? Or would you fight even if the world already painted you as a bitter widow, clinging to scraps of the past? I want you to think about it, really. Think about it. Because in that moment, I wasn't just a grieving woman anymore. I was a woman at war, though I hadn't yet realized it. My throat burned, but I lifted my head and stared at Claire. She dared to smile, to tilt her head as if mocking me. Her eyes said, "He chose me. You lost." Rage surged inside me, hot and relentless, but beneath it was something stronger, an unshakable instinct that this wasn't over. Richard may have signed a paper, but I knew the man I married. He had flaws, many of them. He could be cold, distracted, even selfish. But he was not cruel. He would never leave me without a single word, never humiliate me like this, without reason. Somewhere hidden beneath layers of betrayal, there had to be an explanation, a secret, a page no one had read yet. When the lawyer finished and the judge began wrapping up the session, I felt the eyes of everyone in the room pressing down on me. They expected me to cry, to collapse, to accept the title of discarded wife. But instead, I sat straighter, my breath shallow but steady. Something about Claire's triumphant expression only fueled my suspicion. This wasn't final. This couldn't be final. I knew Richard's handwriting better than anyone. I had written countless grocery lists beside him, corrected his letters, held his hand as he signed birthday cards. If there was deceit in that document, I would find it. If there was a hidden truth, I would drag it into the light. But in that moment, in that suffocating courtroom, I was silent. Let them think I was broken. Let them whisper. Let them enjoy their moment of triumph. Because soon, very soon, they would discover that I was not the kind of woman who surrendered her dignity to lies. Soon they would see that sometimes even the dead can speak, if only you dare to listen closely enough. So I ask you watching this, what would you do? Would you let them bury your life's worth under false smiles and forged signatures? Or would you rise even when your knees trembled, even when everyone believed you had already lost? Comment 1 if you would stand with me, if you believe betrayal must be fought. Like this video if you think justice has to be uncovered no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it. Because this is just the beginning, and I promise you there was a page no one had seen, yet a page that would set fire to everything they thought they knew. When the courtroom emptied that day, the echo of their whispers still clung to me like smoke. People looked at me as though I were some pitiful relic, a woman foolish enough to give her life to a man who left her with nothing. But long before the will was read, I had already sensed a crack in the walls of my marriage, a tremor in the foundation I had believed unshakable. Looking back now, the signs were there, subtle but poisonous, each one a seed of betrayal growing in silence. It began months before Richard died. He had grown weaker, yes, but there was a change in him that had nothing to do with his illness. He stopped asking for me at night. He used to call my name when the coughing seized him, used to cling to my hand like a child lost in a storm. But slowly those nights ended. Instead, it was Claire who stayed by his side, Claire who brought him water, Claire who adjusted his pillows. I told myself it was only convenience, that perhaps he didn't want to wake me. Yet every time I walked into his room, I would find her there already, her hands on his blanket, her voice low and soothing. And his eyes that once sought mine, instinctively shifted to her instead. I remember one evening in particular. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant, a scent that had invaded every corner since Claire moved in as his live-in nurse. I had cooked his favorite stew, the one he had always claimed reminded him of his mother's kitchen. I carried the tray upstairs, balancing the steaming bowl with trembling hands. But when I opened the door, the scene froze me in place. Richard was laughing laughing. Not the weak, cough-laced chuckle I had grown used to, but a genuine, full laugh that shook his frail chest. And Claire, sitting close by, was reading to him from some novel, her hand resting casually on his arm. He turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment his smile faltered, as though caught in something he shouldn't have been enjoying. "Oh," he said, clearing his throat, "you didn't have to bother with dinner. Claire already brought me soup." I stood there with the tray, the smell of stew rising up around me like a mockery. He didn't even touch it. He turned back to her, his lips curved into another faint smile. I placed the tray on the table and left quietly, but my hands shook so violently that the spoon rattled against the bowl. In 30 years of marriage, I had never felt like a stranger in my own husband's room until that night. Other moments followed. Bills arriving in the mail that I had never seen before. Medical receipts signed with handwriting that seemed rushed, almost clumsy, as though someone was imitating a script. I would ask questions, but Richard grew irritable. "Don't worry about it." He would snap his voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "Claire's handling everything. Claire's handling everything." The words became a refrain repeated so often that I began to wonder if I had been quietly replaced, not just as a caregiver, but as a wife. Friends noticed, too. One afternoon, Margaret, a neighbor who had known us for years, stopped me at the grocery store. She leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw Richard yesterday. He was at the garden with that nurse. She was laughing, holding his arm. They looked comfortable. More than comfortable." I forced a smile, my cheeks burning with humiliation, but inside a voice screamed, "Comfortable." Comfortable enough to erase me from the picture entirely. Still, I tried to silence my doubts. After all, Richard was sick. Claire was paid to make him comfortable. Perhaps my jealousy was unkind, even cruel. I told myself I was paranoid that I was twisting kindness into something sinister. But late at night, lying awake alone, I replayed every detail, the sudden way he dismissed me from his room, the secretive looks they exchanged, the way his handwriting on the bills seemed almost forged. Doubt became my constant companion, gnawing at me until even the sound of their laughter felt like knives carving into my chest. One night, I entered his study to look for a book. Richard had always kept his financial papers neatly filed in the top drawer of his desk, but when I pulled it open, I found folders missing, entire sections gone. In their place lay a new folder labeled Simply Care. I opened it and froze. Inside were documents detailing payments, signatures, instructions, all directing funds to Claire. My stomach dropped. I scanned page after page, my fingers trembling. Some of the numbers were staggering. He had transferred sums I didn't even know we had, each one signed with a shaky scrawl of his name. But the letters curved wrong, the strokes uncertain. I knew his handwriting like I knew my own, and this was not his. I confronted him that night, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break free from my ribs. "Richard." "What are these papers?" I demanded, slamming the folder onto his lap. He barely glanced at them, his face pale, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It's none of your concern," he muttered. "Claire is managing things for me. She knows what's best." My voice cracked. "She knows what's best. She's your nurse, Richard. I'm your wife. Do you even remember that?" His eyes flicked up at me sharp and defensive, and for the first time I saw not the man I married, but a stranger. "You're overreacting," he snapped before turning his head away, as if dismissing me like a servant who had spoken out of turn. That night I wept into my pillow, silent sobs that shook my body. I felt as though I had already been erased, like I was watching my marriage disintegrate while I was still in it. The betrayal was subtle, but it was real. It clung to every corner of our house, every whispered laugh between them, every missing document. I knew something was happening behind my back, something bigger than I could yet see, and though I didn't have proof then, I felt it deep in my bones. Claire wasn't just his nurse. She was weaving herself into the fabric of his life stitch by stitch, until I no longer belonged in the tapestry. Looking back now, I see that was the first round of betrayal, the beginning of the storm that would one day explode in that courtroom. But at the time, I was just a woman, suffocating in doubt, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing everything I had built. The truth was that the foundation was already crumbling. And no matter how tightly I clung to the memories of our vows, I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, preparing to swallow me whole. The night after I found those documents, I couldn't sleep. I walked the halls of the house barefoot, my steps echoing on the wooden floors, every creak sounding like the house itself was crying out with me. I stopped in front of Richard's study, the door closed, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering. That room had once been the heart of our home, where we planned vacations, argued over bills, dreamed about retirement. Now it felt like a vault of secrets, a place where whispers grew teeth. My chest ached with the heaviness of not knowing, of suspecting something monstrous, but having no proof. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. Then fate intervened. A week later, I got a call from Daniel, a young assistant who had worked in Richard's lawyer's office. He'd always been kind to me at holiday parties, bringing me drinks and asking about my garden. His voice on the phone was hesitant, almost trembling. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "I shouldn't be calling you, but I think you need to see something." I met him at a small cafe across town, the kind of place where the lights were dim and the booths swallowed you whole, perfect for secrets. He slid into the seat opposite me, a folder tucked under his arm. His eyes darted around the room as if we were criminals conspiring. "I could lose my job for this," he whispered, "but I can't stay quiet, not after what I saw." I gripped the edge of the table. "What did you see?" He pulled out a sheet of paper and laid it in front of me. It was a draft of Richard's will. I stared at the familiar name printed in bold at the top. My husband. My throat tightened, but then my eyes caught the scrawl of his signature at the bottom. At first glance, it looked like his handwriting, but the longer I studied it, the more wrong it felt. The angle of the R was off the loops in the J too shallow. My stomach twisted. Daniel leaned closer. "I've seen your husband sign dozens of documents. He was meticulous. But this?" He tapped the paper. "This isn't him. It's close, but it's not him. I think someone forged it." The cafe seemed to shrink around me, the noise of clinking cups and laughter fading into a dull roar. Who I whispered, though the answer was already clawing at the back of my mind. He hesitated. "Your husband came into the office with the nurse, Claire. She was the one carrying the folder. She said he wasn't feeling well, that she'd help him through the paperwork. But the thing is..." He lowered his voice even further. "I never once saw him sign in front of the lawyer. Claire handled the documents, moving them in and out like she was orchestrating the whole thing." I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heart slam against my ribs. Images flashed through my mind, her smug smile in court, her fingers on the pearls that had once been mine, her voice telling me with subtle contempt, "He needs rest. I'll take care of it." Daniel wasn't finished. He reached back into the folder and pulled out another draft. "This is the earlier version before Claire got involved. It leaves the house and most of the estate to you, with smaller bequests to other family members. But after she started showing up, everything changed. Everything." Tears stung my eyes, but I forced them back. I couldn't let them fall here, not in front of this young man who risked his career to show me the truth. My voice came out hoarse. "Why are you telling me this?" He swallowed hard. "Because I've seen too many families torn apart by lies, Mrs. Johnson. And I know what it looks like when someone is being manipulated. I thought you deserved to know before it was too late." For a long moment, I sat there staring at the pages spread before me. My hands trembled as I touched the signatures, comparing them, memorizing every slant and stroke. It was undeniable. The earlier will was Richard's hand, steady and strong. The later draft was weaker, uneven, like a clumsy imitation. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was ink on paper, black and permanent. I thanked Daniel, my voice barely more than a whisper. He slipped the folder back under his arm and rose to leave. Before he turned away, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Be careful," he said softly. She's smarter than she looks." His words lingered long after he left. I sat in that cafe until the coffee went cold, staring at the grain of the wooden table, as if it might offer me some kind of comfort. But there was no comfort, only fire. A slow burning fire that spread from my chest, outward, filling every part of me with anger, with grief, with the unshakable certainty that I was being erased. When I returned home that evening, Claire was there, bustling around the kitchen as though she owned it. She looked up with that same infuriating smile. "Oh, Mrs. Johnson," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "You're home late. I made dinner for Richard. He was too tired to wait for you." Her words were sharp, calculated, each one a reminder of my displacement. I forced a smile, biting down on my tongue until I tasted blood. How thoughtful, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I wanted to scream that I knew what she was doing, that her lies would unravel, that her forged documents would burn under the light of truth. But I held it in, for now. That night, as I watched Richard sleep, I studied his face, the man I had loved for most of my life. He looked so frail, so fragile, his breaths shallow, his skin pale. I wanted to believe he was innocent in all of this, that he had no part in the deception. But the documents told a different story. Whether he was complicit or coerced, I no longer knew. All I knew was that Claire had her claws in him, and she was pulling the strings of my life. The whispers in the courtroom had felt like poison. But now, holding the evidence Daniel had given me, the poison transformed into steel. I would not be erased. I would not be silenced. For the first time in months, my grief gave way to something stronger, determination. And yet I knew this was only the beginning. The truth was wider, deeper, darker than I could yet imagine. Claire was not simply a nurse who had wormed her way into Richard's trust. She was orchestrating something far bigger. And as I closed my eyes that night, I realized that if I didn't act soon, I might lose not just my inheritance, but the very memory of who I had been in his life. Isolation is a crueler weapon than any blade, and by the time the weeks wore on, that weapon had been sharpened to its finest edge against me. After Daniel showed me those draft documents, after he whispered the word forgery, I thought the truth would strengthen me. But truth, when no one else believes, it is nothing more than a stone tied around your neck as you drown. At first, I tried to share my suspicions quietly. One evening at dinner, my son Matthew sat across the table pushing peas around his plate, while Claire floated around the kitchen as if she owned it. I leaned closer to him, my voice low. "Something is wrong, Matt. Your father's will. I don't think those papers are real." His fork clattered against the plate as he looked up, his face pale. "Mom, don't start this," he said firmly, glancing toward the kitchen where Claire hummed to herself. "Dad trusted her. He wanted her to handle things. Can't you accept that?" The words pierced me deeper than I expected. My own son, the boy I had carried in my arms through fevers, the boy whose knees I had patched when he scraped them, now looked at me as though I were a bitter woman inventing lies. I am his wife. I whispered, my voice trembling. For 30 years I stood by his side. Don't you think it's strange that suddenly everything belongs to her? But Matthew shook his head. His eyes hardened. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. Dad didn't want to burden you with paperwork. That's all it is. Grieving, not thinking clearly. The words stung worse than a slap. Soon others joined the chorus. My sister-in-law stopped by one afternoon with a basket of fruit, her smile tight and her words sharper than the knife she used to slice apples in my kitchen. We all see what's happening, Margaret, she said. Richard needed care and Claire gave it to him. Maybe you should be grateful. You weren't enough for him at the end. I stared at her, unable to breathe, each syllable lodging itself like a thorn in my chest. Not enough. 30 years, and now I was reduced to nothing. The whispers spread beyond family. At church, where once neighbors had offered me condolences with warm hands and soft eyes, I began to feel their pity twist into judgment. I heard them in the pews behind me. Poor woman, no wonder he left it all to the nurse. She must not have been much of a wife. I suppose Claire earned it taking care of him day and night. Their voices dripped with condescension, each word a knife twisting deeper. Even my friends, the women who had once crowded my kitchen table with laughter and shared recipes, began to avoid me. When I called, they were suddenly busy. When I visited, they offered polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It was as though Claire's shadow had spread across the entire neighborhood, and I was the villain in her story. But nothing broke me more than the night Richard himself turned on me. He was weaker than his breaths shallow, his skin gray, but his words were sharper than they had ever been. I had brought him tea, hoping for a moment of the man I had loved, the man who had once whispered promises into my hair. But when I set the cup down, he looked at me with cold eyes. "Why are you always questioning her?" he rasped. "Claire has been more loyal to me these past months than you have in years." I froze the cup, trembling in my hands. "More loyal," I whispered. "Richard, I gave you my life. I gave you my youth, my dreams, everything I had. And you say, she's more loyal." His face twisted with irritation. "You're bitter. That's your problem. Always suspicious, always doubting. Claire believes in me. She doesn't nag, she doesn't question. She's what I need." The tea spilled as my hands shook drops, staining the white sheets. He turned his face away from me, dismissing me like a stranger. In that moment, I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just the loss of his trust, it was the loss of my place in his life. I was no longer the woman he turned to in the night. I was the shadow haunting the corners, the ghost of a love he had chosen to forget. From then on, every gesture from Claire was calculated to deepen the wound. She answered the phone before I could. She signed forms while I stood in the hallway, ignored. She corrected me in front of visitors, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't worry, Margaret, I'll handle it. You wouldn't understand." And people believed her. They believed her calm voice, her pristine uniforms, her practiced smile. One night, I overheard her speaking on the phone in the study. Her voice was low, but the walls carried sound. "Yes," she said, "everything is under control. He trusts me completely. She's falling apart. Soon no one will question it." The words made my blood run cold. I pressed my back to the wall, my hands covering my mouth to stifle a cry. She knew. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she relished it. But when I tried to tell Matthew, he shook his head again. "Mom, you're hearing things. Claire wouldn't say that. She's the only reason Dad lasted this long. Please stop embarrassing yourself." Embarrassing myself? That was what I had become. A woman raving about conspiracies, dismissed even by her own son. The house itself seemed to conspire against me. I walked through rooms filled with laughter that no longer belonged to me, with whispers I wasn't meant to hear. Even my reflection in the mirror became unrecognizable eyes, swollen from crying. Shoulders hunched under the weight of humiliation. I had always thought dignity was something no one could take from me, but now even that felt stolen. Still beneath the despair, a stubborn ember remained. Late at night, when Claire's footsteps faded down the hall and the house grew still, I clutched the draft Daniel had given me. I studied the signatures, traced the lines with trembling fingers, compared them, until my vision blurred. I knew what was true. I knew what was real. And though the world called me bitter, delusional, even senile, I clung to that ember with everything I had left. Because I also knew one thing with absolute certainty: isolation is not the end. Isolation is the test before the storm, and storms, once they break, do not whisper. They roar. I used to believe the worst kind of pain was grief, that losing the person you loved most would be the deepest wound you could carry. I was wrong. There is something worse than grief. It is humiliation. It is being stripped of dignity while you are still alive, forced to watch as people you trusted turn their backs and the world laughs in whispers at your downfall. By the time winter set in, I was living inside that humiliation every single day. The house that once rang with warmth had turned into a theater, and I was the unwanted extra on stage. Claire directed every scene. She had woven herself so completely into Richard's life that even the walls seemed to listen to her before me. She greeted visitors at the door, accepted casseroles from neighbors, offered updates on his health, and when people asked about me, she would smile sweetly and say, "Oh, she's resting." It's all too much for her. The pity in their eyes was unbearable. They saw me not as a wife fighting for her husband, but as a fragile relic slowly fading into irrelevance. Every conversation was another blow. Friends who once looked up to me now tilted their heads with condescending sympathy. "Claire has been such a blessing," they would say. "You're lucky Richard had someone like her. Lucky." The word curdled in my stomach. Was I lucky to be erased? Lucky to watch another woman sit at my husband's bedside while I was told to rest. Lucky to be silenced in my own home. The whispers followed me into public spaces. At the grocery store, 2 women from church stood by the produce aisle, their voices hushed but sharp. I heard Richard left everything to the nurse one said. Poor Margaret, but honestly, maybe she wasn't doing enough. He needed someone younger, stronger. My hands tightened on the shopping cart until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream to tell them I had given my life to him, that loyalty is not measured in youth or strength, but in sacrifice. But instead I walked past them, my cheeks burning their words, echoing like curses. At night, the house grew colder both in temperature and spirit. I tried to care for Richard, to sit by his side, but he pushed me away with words that cut deeper than any knife. "Leave me alone," he would mutter. "You nag too much. Claire knows how to make me comfortable." Why can't you? Each time he said it, a part of me shriveled. The man I had once called my anchor now spoke to me as though I were an intruder. Sometimes I would sit in the hallway listening to the sound of their laughter drifting from his room. Laughter that used to belong to us. Laughter that now mocked me with its absence. I began to lose myself. My reflection in the mirror no longer looked like me. My eyes were ringed with shadows, my shoulders hunched, my mouth turned downward in permanent defeat. Even my own body betrayed me. I lost weight, food tasting like ash in my mouth. Sleep eluded me. When it came, it was filled with nightmares. Richard turning his back on me, Claire locking me out of my own home, my son watching silently as I begged for scraps of love. And still I tried to fight in small ways. I confronted Claire one night when she came out of his room carrying a folder. "What are you doing with his papers?" I demanded. She looked at me with that calm, poisonous smile. "Managing what you can't," she said softly. "Don't worry, Margaret. Everything is under control." I lunged for the folder, but she pulled it back effortlessly, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Careful," she whispered. "You wouldn't want Richard to think you're hysterical." Hysterical. The word dripped with venom designed to crush me further. And the worst part, it worked. When I tried to tell Richard what I had seen, he snapped, "You're imagining things. Stop embarrassing yourself." The humiliation reached its peak the night of the family dinner. Richard insisted on having everyone over a celebration of sorts, though he could barely sit upright. Claire orchestrated everything, arranging the table, serving dishes, even pouring the wine. I sat at the far end watching my family laugh and toast while I remained invisible. At one point, Claire stood to give a little speech. "We've all been through so much," she said, her hand resting possessively on Richard's shoulder. "But I want to thank Richard for trusting me to take care of him. It has been an honor." The room erupted in applause. Applause. For her. For the woman who had stolen my place, my dignity, my marriage. I sat frozen, my hands trembling under the tablecloth. My son clapped, too, his face lit with admiration. Not once did he glance at me, the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything for this family. In that moment, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. When the dinner ended and guests filed out with warm hugs for Claire and only polite nods for me, I retreated to my bedroom and collapsed onto the bed. For the first time, I let the despair consume me completely. I sobbed until my body shook, until I could barely breathe. I I pressed my face into the pillow, muffling the sound because even in my own grief, I was afraid of being overheard and ridiculed. I thought of leaving, of packing a bag and walking out, disappearing into anonymity. But then, where would I go? What would become of me? The house, the marriage, the life I had built. It was all slipping away piece by piece into her hands. One night, standing by the window, I stared at the bare branches outside, swaying in the winter wind. For the first time, I felt the weight of surrender pressing against me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was hysterical. Maybe I was nothing more than a bitter widow in training clinging to illusions. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, my hands covering my face. The thought that terrified me most wasn't losing the house or the money. It was losing myself, my dignity, my place in this world, my identity as a wife, as a mother, as a woman who mattered. It was a crisis, the kind that leaves you hollow and empty. And for a while, I believed I might never rise from it. The humiliation had reached its peak. I was alone, mocked, dismissed, stripped of love and respect. My marriage was crumbling before my eyes, and the world cheered on the woman who had taken it from me. But deep in that darkness, a whisper of defiance stirred. As I sat there on the cold floor, tears soaking my hands, I remembered Daniel's words, "Be careful. She's smarter than she looks." And I remembered the draft he had shown me, the one that still bore Richard's true handwriting, his true intentions. That ember I had clung to the belief that truth was on my side flickered faintly. It was nearly smothered, but it was still there. And though I was broken, nearly destroyed, I knew this was not the end. It was the bottom of the pit. And sometimes the bottom is where you finally find the ground to push yourself back up. The night after that humiliating family dinner, I thought I had finally been broken. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, the faint ticking of the clock mocking me with its rhythm. Every sound of the house, Claire's footsteps padding confidently down the hallway, Richard's weak cough muffled behind his door, felt like a reminder that I no longer belonged. But sometimes fate hides its weapons in plain sight. Sometimes the very thing meant to destroy you leaves behind a clue, a thread to pull until the whole fabric unravels. It happened the following morning. I had woken early, restless from another night without sleep. My body moved on autopilot, wandering through the house in silence. I ended up in the attic, a place I rarely visited. Dust clung to the rafters and boxes of forgotten years lay stacked like tombstones of our life together. I pulled one, open, searching for nothing in particular, maybe just a distraction from the gnawing despair. Inside was a small wooden jewelry box I hadn't seen in decades. It had once belonged to Richard's mother, passed down to me on our wedding day. I lifted the lid, and among the tarnished rings and broken chains was something that stopped my breath. A folded envelope yellowed at the edges, sealed with the careful handwriting I knew better than my own. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before his death. My eyes devoured the words. "My dearest Margaret," it began, and already tears blurred my vision. "If you are reading this, it means things have not gone as I hoped. I have trusted people I should not trust. I fear I may be manipulated in ways I can no longer control. If you hear words that make you doubt my love for you, please do not believe them. Know this, you were my partner, in every sense my true companion. If a will is ever read that strips you of your dignity, do not despair. There is another page hidden that tells the truth. Look closely. You will find it." The letter slipped from my fingers as I gasped, my chest tight, my tears hot on my cheeks. Another page, a hidden truth. He had known. He had seen the betrayal circling like vultures, even as I struggled to convince myself it wasn't real. And he had tried to protect me in the only way he could, by leaving me this message, a thread of hope from beyond the grave. The despair that had consumed me began to shift, replaced by something I hadn't felt in months: resolve. My husband's words lit a fire inside me. For weeks, Claire had convinced me I was hysterical, my family had treated me like a burden, and even Richard's own voice, twisted by her poison, had wounded me deeper than I thought I could endure. But now I had proof, not the kind that could be waived in court yet, but enough to remind me of who I was. I was not the bitter, broken widow they wanted me to be. I was Richard's wife, the woman he had chosen to trust with his last confession. I tucked the letter close to my heart and sat there in the dusty attic, whispering into the silence. I will find it, Richard. I will find that page. And when I do, they will all know the truth. From that moment, my posture changed. My voice sharpened and my steps grew firmer. Claire noticed, of course. She always noticed everything. One afternoon, she narrowed her eyes at me across the kitchen. "You seem different," she said, her voice coated in false sweetness. I smiled back, the first genuine smile in weeks. Maybe I am. She didn't press further, but I saw the flicker of unease in her expression. For once, she wasn't the only one holding secrets. I began searching relentlessly. At night, when the house was quiet, I pored over every folder, every envelope, every stack of papers Claire thought she had hidden. I studied the margins of the will, running my fingers over the pages, hunting for any sign of the other page Richard had promised. Each discovery fueled me further, the forged signatures, the missing drafts, the inconsistencies that others had ignored. I documented everything, storing copies in a safe place because I knew the storm ahead would be brutal. The isolation was still there. My son still doubted me. The whispers still lingered. But I no longer felt crushed by them. Instead, every cruel word, every dismissive glance became fuel. I was no longer drowning in grief. I was sharpening my weapons. And Claire, for all her cleverness, had no idea that the woman she thought defeated was now preparing for war. So I ask you watching this now, what would you do if you found a letter like that, a voice from the grave telling you not to give up? Would you crumble believing the lies, or would you rise even if you had to stand alone against the world? Comment 1 if you would fight back with me. Like this video if you believe betrayal must always be exposed, because the storm was coming, and I was ready to meet it head on. The letter burned in my pocket like a secret flame, its words echoing in my mind every time I saw Claire glide through the house with that arrogant grace. I carried it with me everywhere, folded close to my chest, as though Richard's voice itself had become my armor. For weeks I stayed silent, biding my time, studying her every move. But silence has a breaking point, and mine came one bitter night in late February. The house was still, except for the hum of the furnace and Richard's shallow breathing upstairs. I stood in the hallway outside his study, listening to the faint rustle of papers. The door was closed, but light spilled out from the crack beneath it. I knew she was inside. The very room that had once belonged to my husband's mind, his books, his journals, his work, had become her lair. Something inside me snapped. My hand tightened on the doorknob, and before I could second-guess myself, I pushed it open. Claire looked up, startled, for only a moment before that familiar mask slipped back into place. She sat at the desk with a glass of wine at her elbow, stacks of papers spread out before her like she was the rightful mistress of the house. "Margaret," she said smoothly, her lips curving into a practiced smile. "You should be resting. You look tired." I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me with a deliberate click. My voice was low but steady. "I want you out of that chair." Her eyebrows arched, the smile sharpening into amusement. "Out of the chair." "Why? Because you suddenly remembered you used to sit here with him. Times have changed, dear. You should accept that." I moved closer, every step fueled by the weeks of humiliation I had endured. "You think you've won," I said. "You think a forged signature and a fake smile can erase 30 years of marriage. But you don't know me, Claire. You don't know what I've found." For the first time, her composure faltered. She leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the folded envelope from my pocket and placed it on the desk between us. "He left me this," I whispered. "His words, his warning. He knew you were manipulating him. He knew there was another page. Her hand twitched toward the envelope, but I covered it with mine. Our eyes locked, and for the first time I saw the crack in her armor. She wasn't untouchable. She was afraid. Her voice hardened. That letter means nothing. A dying man scribbling his paranoia, no one will believe it. I leaned closer, so close I could smell the sourness of wine on her breath. It means everything. And soon everyone will know what you did. For a moment silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then she laughed sharp and cruel. You think anyone will listen to you? Look at yourself, Margaret. You're pathetic. Even your son thinks you've lost your mind. I've won their trust. You have nothing. Her words sliced through me, but I didn't flinch. I still have the truth, I said softly, and the truth has a way of clawing its way out no matter how deep you bury it. Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold sneer. Be careful, she hissed. You don't know what I'm capable of. I straightened my hand, still pressing down on the envelope. And you don't know what grief can make a woman capable of. You took my dignity, Claire. You turned my husband against me. You poisoned my son's trust. You paraded yourself as a saint while you stole everything that was mine. But you made one mistake. Her eyes flashed. And what's that? I lifted the letter slowly, holding it close to my chest again. You underestimated me. Her lips parted as if to respond, but I didn't wait. I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting in the study, her mask finally cracking. My hands shook my knees, nearly buckled as I closed the door behind me, but inside something fierce had awoken. For the first time in months, I felt the balance shift. I had confronted her. I had seen fear flicker in her eyes, and I knew then that the storm was closer than ever. The day of the hearing came wrapped in gray clouds, the kind that hung heavy over the city like a warning. I walked into the courthouse alone, my black coat pulled tight around me. Richard's letter pressed against my chest like a shield. My steps echoed down the marble hallway, and though my body trembled, I held my head high. Today silence would end. Today the truth would no longer whisper, it would roar. The courtroom was crowded, every seat filled with family neighbors and curious onlookers. Whispers buzzed like bees as I entered their eyes, following me with pity and judgment. At the front, Claire sat poised, dressed in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back neatly, her lips curved in that smug smile I had grown to hate. She looked like victory incarnate, like she already held the keys to my life. My son Matthew sat beside her, his face tight with uncertainty, but still turned toward her, as though she were the one holding his future. The judge called the session to order, and the lawyer began reading through the will once again. The words struck like hammers. I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate to Ms. Claire Williams. Gasps rippled through the room, though most already knew. Claire's smile widened, her hands folded neatly on the table, as if she were accepting her crown. I sat still, my palms pressed flat against my knees, waiting. When the lawyer finished, the judge asked if there were any objections. That was the moment. My body felt as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, but I stood. My voice rang out steadier than I expected. Yes, Your Honor. I object. The room erupted in murmurs, heads swiveling to look at me. Claire tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. Here we go, she whispered loudly enough for those around her to hear. But the judge raised a hand for silence. State your grounds, Mrs. Johnson. I stepped forward, each movement deliberate. Because this will is incomplete, I said firmly. My husband left behind a page that changes everything. The lawyer scoffed. Your Honor, this is absurd. The will is notarized, sealed, and verified. But I reached into my coat and pulled out the letter, unfolding it with trembling hands. This is my husband's handwriting, his words. He warned me there was another page. He knew someone was manipulating him. He left this so I would not be silenced. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge motioned for the bailiff to bring the letter forward. I watched as it was handed up, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear. The judge read silently, his brow furrowing before nodding slowly. This appears consistent with Mr. Johnson's known handwriting. It references an additional page. Claire shifted in her seat, her smile stiffening. "This is nonsense," she said quickly, her voice sharp. Anyone could have forged that letter. I turned toward her, my voice cutting through the murmurs. "Funny you should mention forgery, because the will you paraded as truth, it isn't my husband's hand, not the way I knew it, and I have a witness from your own lawyer's office who saw you handling the documents." At that, Daniel rose from the back row, stepping forward nervously. "It's true," he said. "I worked at Mr. Johnson's attorney's office. I saw Ms. Williams bring the drafts. I never once saw Mr. Johnson sign them himself, and the earlier drafts left everything to Mrs. Johnson." The courtroom exploded. People whispered eyes-wide necks, craning toward Claire. For the first time, her mask cracked, her lips pressed into a thin line, her face flushed red. She slammed her hand on the table. Lies, all lies. But the judge's gavel thundered down. Enough. He looked back at the documents. "This court will pause to verify this letter and examine all drafts of the will. Until then, no transfer of assets will be recognized." I felt my knees nearly buckle with relief, but I steadied myself. I wasn't finished. I turned to the crowd, to my son, to everyone who had doubted me. My voice shook with fury and grief. "Do you see now? Do you see how easily trust can be twisted? How betrayal wears the mask of kindness? I was told I was hysterical, delusional, unworthy. But the truth was here, all along. He loved me. He trusted me. And she," I pointed to Claire, whose face was twisted with panic. She tried to erase me. Gasps rippled again, and Matthew's eyes filled with tears. He looked from me to Claire, his face crumbling with realization. "Mom." He whispered the word, breaking like glass in his throat. Claire stood suddenly, her composure gone. "You think you've won," she spat, her voice shrill. "You'll get nothing. You're weak. Everyone knows it." I stepped closer, my voice calm but razor sharp. "I was weak, Claire. You made me doubt myself. You made me believe I was nothing. But today, everyone sees you for what you are." The judge's gavel fell again, the sound echoing like thunder. "Court is adjourned pending further investigation. Ms. Williams, you will remain under review for potential charges of fraud." The room erupted in noise, but all I heard was the silence inside me, the silence of a weight finally lifting, of chains breaking. For the first time in months, I could breathe. I left the courtroom without looking back at Claire, who sat frozen in her seat, her perfect mask shattered into pieces she could never glue together again. Outside, the gray clouds parted, and a shaft of sunlight cut through warm against my face. It felt like Richard himself had reached down to remind me I was not erased. I was still here. And I had won back my voice. The courthouse doors swung open, and the world outside felt different. The cold February air bit at my cheeks, but it carried something I hadn't felt in months: freedom. Yet freedom comes with a price, and sometimes, with witnesses you never expect. By the time I stepped onto the stone steps, the crowd had gathered. They weren't just family anymore. Neighbors, old friends, even strangers who had slipped inside the courtroom now surrounded me. And for the first time, they weren't whispering against me. They were whispering for me. I heard it ripple through the group. She was telling the truth. The nurse forged everything. Imagine a wife nearly erased. Their voices carried outrage, not pity. Justice wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever watched a mask of kindness hide cruelty. Then, as though fate demanded it, a voice rose above the crowd. Mrs. Green, my next-door neighbor of 20 years, stepped forward. Her hands shook as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I saw her," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I saw that nurse sneak out of the house at night with stacks of papers. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to intrude. Now I know." She turned to me, her eyes filled with regret. "I should have spoken sooner. I should have told you." Before I could answer, another voice cut in. Father Andrews, our parish priest, pushed his way to the front. His face was stern, the way it was when he delivered sermons about sin and redemption. I, too, suspected he said solemnly, When I visited Richard, the nurse never let me speak to him alone. She always intercepted, always answered for him. It was wrong. I see now what she was hiding. His words carried weight, echoing over the murmurs until the crowd hushed. And then came the most unexpected witness of all, my son. Matthew stepped out of the courthouse behind me, his face pale, his eyes swollen from tears he had tried to hide. For a long moment he stood frozen, torn between shame and courage. Then he walked toward me, his voice breaking. "Mom," he whispered loud enough for all to hear. I heard her. I heard Claire one night when I came by to check on Dad. She was on the phone talking about how she'd make sure you looked crazy. I didn't say anything because I wanted to believe she cared for him. His voice cracked and he dropped his gaze. But I was wrong. I'm so sorry. The words hung in the air like a confession at Mass. The crowd gasped, and for the first time their eyes turned not with judgment, but with sympathy, even respect. A neighbor muttered, "The boy was fooled like the rest of us." Another said, "That woman tricked everyone." The fire spread, and with it the truth grew larger than Claire's lies could ever contain. I turned to my son, my voice soft but steady. "You were blinded by love for your father. I don't blame you, but now you see." He nodded, tears spilling, and for the first time in months, I felt his hand clasp mine, not out of duty, but out of love. The scandal was no longer a private wound. It had become a public reckoning. Reporters scribbled in notebooks, cameras clicked, and neighbors argued heatedly about betrayal and justice. People who had once pitied me now rallied around me. Their voices joined together like a choir. She deserves her dignity. The nurse should face prison. Justice for the wife. And as I stood on those courthouse steps surrounded by voices that finally spoke the truth, I realized this was bigger than me. This was about every woman silenced by whispers, every spouse discarded for someone younger, every person told their pain was hysteria. My story had become their story, a mirror of betrayal and resilience. So I ask you watching this now, if you had been in that crowd, if you had seen the truth rip free from lies, what would you have done? Would you have stood with me? Would you have shouted for justice? Comment 1 if you believe the truth can never stay hidden. Like this video if you believe betrayal always burns no matter how carefully it is wrapped in smiles. Because on that day, the fire spread, and no amount of lies could put it out. The days that followed were a whirlwind of hearings, interviews, and headlines. What had once been whispered in the shadows was now shouted in bold letters across newspapers and television screens. Nurse accused of forging will. Widow fights back. Justice for Margaret Johnson. For weeks, I had walked with my head bowed in shame, but now when I stepped outside, strangers stopped me to clasp my hands to say, "We believe you." Claire, the woman who once carried herself like a queen, was nowhere to be seen in public. The very people who had once praised her now crossed the street to avoid her. At the grocery store, I overheard whispers. "That's the one who tried to steal everything. She fooled us all." Her name had become a curse, her smile remembered not as kindness, but as poison. The mask she had worn so well was shattered, and beneath it lay only the ugliness of greed. The law moved swiftly. The evidence piled high, the forged signatures, the testimony of witnesses, the letter Richard had hidden for me. Piece by piece, her story collapsed. The final blow came when investigators found recordings on her phone, snippets of conversations where she bragged about how easily she had convinced Richard to sign papers he barely understood. It was enough. She was charged with fraud and forgery, stripped not only of her reputation but of her freedom. I didn't rejoice when I saw her led away in handcuffs. I simply felt the air return to my lungs, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying finally lifted. As for me, the court reinstated Richard's original will, the one that left our home and savings to me, his wife. There were tears when the judge declared it official, not because of the money. I had never cared for riches, but because in that moment, my dignity was restored. My marriage, though scarred by betrayal, was not erased. His true voice had been heard, and my place in his life was acknowledged for all to see. Matthew came to me afterward, his eyes downcast with shame. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I cupped his face in my hands, my voice soft but unwavering. "You were deceived like all of us. What matters is that you see the truth now. We move forward together." His tears soaked my palms as he nodded, and for the first time in so long, I felt the bond between mother and son mend. But there were scars. Nights when I woke to the memory of Richard's harsh words under Claire's influence. Days when I stared at the empty chair across the kitchen table and wondered how much of him she had stolen from me in his final months. Those wounds may never fully heal, yet I learned something vital. Dignity is not given. It is reclaimed piece by piece, no matter how deep the betrayal. Claire lost everything: her job, her freedom, her reputation. But I gained something she could never understand. I gained back my voice, my place, my truth. And in the silence of my home, as the sunlight poured once again through the windows, I whispered to Richard's photograph, "You tried to protect me, and I carried your words until they saved me." Spring arrived slowly, as if even the seasons were hesitant after such a long winter of lies. I sat on the porch of the house Richard and I had built together, watching the first buds bloom on the trees. The air was crisp, but carried a sweetness of renewal, the kind that tells you life insists on continuing, no matter how broken you've been. For the first time in months, I felt the warmth on my skin, without shame pressing against me. Inside the walls no longer whispered with Claire's voice. The silence was mine again, not the silence of humiliation, but of peace. I filled it with small rituals, brewing tea in the morning, tending the flowers Richard once promised he'd plant, but never did, walking through the rooms with windows wide open to let the light pour in. These were not just chores. They were acts of reclaiming. Every corner of this house now belonged to me again, not to the shadow of betrayal. Sometimes I still looked at Richard's photograph, my heart aching with complicated love. I had loved him deeply, and he had been blind to the danger in his last days. But I chose not to let those poison months define the 30 years we shared. His laughter, his touch, his steady presence, they were not erased. They lived on in me, stronger than Claire's lies, stronger than the humiliation. The letter he left was his final gift, his way of saying, "I still see you. I still honor you." And I would carry that truth for the rest of my days. Matthew visited often now, guilt still heavy in his eyes, but slowly replaced with tenderness. One afternoon as we sat in the garden, he said, "Mom, I've learned more from watching you fight than I ever did in school. You didn't just protect yourself. You showed me what dignity means." His words filled me with both pride and sorrow, for no mother wishes to teach her child through pain. But I knew his lesson was carved into him forever, and that was a legacy no one could take from me. The world outside continued to buzz with gossip, but it no longer mattered. Claire's trial made headlines, her downfall dissected in every paper. Strangers whispered her name like a warning, a reminder of how greed wears disguises. But my name, once coated with pity, now carried something else: respect, strength, resilience. As I sit here telling you this story, I want you to understand the lesson etched into every scar I carry. Love can blind you. Betrayal can break you. Lies can strip you bare. But dignity can always be reclaimed, even when the world doubts you, even when your own family turns against you, even when you are left alone with nothing but a letter and a trembling hope. Dignity waits for the moment you stand, even on shaking legs, and say, "Enough." So I ask you now, if you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have risked everything to reclaim your voice? Comment 1 if you believe dignity is worth fighting for, even when the world tells you otherwise. Like this video if you believe truth always eventually rises to the surface. Because this is not just my story. It is the story of anyone who has been silenced, anyone who has been betrayed, anyone who has been told they are less than what they know themselves to be. And if my voice reaches you today, let it be a reminder: betrayal may wound you, but it does not define you. Justice may take time, but it always arrives for those who refuse to give up. I close my eyes now and breathe in the spring air, the warmth of sunlight painting my face. I am no longer the broken widow they pitied, nor the hysterical woman they dismissed. I am Margaret Johnson. I am the wife who reclaimed her truth. And though the scars remain, they shine like proof that I survived the fire and walked out with my dignity intact.